www.offthecorner.net. I'm Rallo, and you are watching the Fact Project here on Full Blast with the DJ Tiger. Salute to him. FACT is an acronym that stands for Fundamental African-Centered Thought. The goal here on the FACT Project is to convey some thoughts and some information to members of our community. We are slated to have join us today Sister Sheila Brown, who has done her share of research on the great Amy Jacques Garvey, who is the wife of the Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And we've done a special this month on Marcus Garvey. And we had Brother Ajay Taimba join us in the first Monday of the month to talk about not only Black August, but he touched on the Right Honorable Marcus Garvey. We were slated to have with us the second week Baba Mosi, and I was trying to get Brother Senghor Baye, who was involved in the UNIA in the Washington, D.C. area, but they were both out of the country at the time, and Brother Baba Mosi was in a place where he had no access to Wi-Fi. So I had to read from my book, the Fact Book, and I did my sort of biography on the life of the Right Honorable Marcus Garvey. And last week we had Brother Raymond Duguay, who waxed poetic about Marcus Garvey and the Garvey movement. Before we bring our guests on, I do want to say that the campaign that was started by Brother Ajay Taimba to raise money for Brother Dhoruba bin Wahad is still ongoing. They did reach their goal, but people are still continuing to donate. Brother Dhoruba bin Wahad is was a political prisoner. He's a former New York Panther and continues to be a long-distance revolutionary for our people. So I would urge you to go ahead and go to that link if you want to contribute to Brother Dhoruba, who is having some health challenges as of right now. Not only that, the campaign against Netflix is still ongoing, having been launched by CMOTAP, the Committee to Eliminate Media Offensive to African People, as well as the Clear the Airways Projects and a few other groups have come together in one accord to launch a campaign against Netflix because of their disrespectful portrayal of Black people in their animated reboot of Good Times. So if anyone wants to get involved with the campaign, the first call is to cancel your Netflix subscription, and a lot of people have done so. The second call is to send them an open letter. The open letter is available at offthecorner.net. So anyone want to copy paste that open letter, you can do so by going to offthecorner.net. You can put that in an email, or you can copy paste that and put that in snail mail and get that over to Netflix. Apart from that, there is a change.org campaign as well that a person can sign if they want to get involved in the activity against Netflix. Without any further procrastination, we want to welcome our guest, Sister Sheila Brown. Sheila, welcome to the Fact Project. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, King. It's a pleasure to be here, especially to talk about my favorite subject of all times, the Honorable Amy Jacques Garvey and the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey as well.
Okay. And I'm looking forward to this. Amy Jacques Garvey was the second wife of Marcus Garvey, and she was born in Jamaica. Now, I'm basically at this point going to give you the floor, and I'm going to just let you go from there. I will be chiming in to ask questions, but what can you tell us about Amy Jacques Garvey?
What isn't there that I can't tell you about Mother Amy Jacques Garvey? So first, I do hope that we can participate in this conversation. I welcome you to share your insights as well. But Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey is what I refer to as, or who I refer to as, the most significant woman of the 20th century. And I say that with all sincerity. If people took the time to incorporate what she has left us into their everyday thinking, in their everyday lessons for our children and even college students, and incorporate some of the powerful insights that she left to us, not just about her confidant, partner, husband, leader, and prolific um, in a prolific thought leader, but also what she left for us about how organizations run, about organizational development, about the administration of the most prolific organization to have existed for Black people in the 20th century and arguably till today. There has not been a single movement of the scale of the influence of the power and economic prowess that the UNIA had to date. This was not just an organization, it was very seriously, to the people of the time, a representative government that encompassed all people of African descent, whether they were in the continent, in the United States, in Europe, even in India. What the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey often referred to as his representing the 400 million, 400,000 or million, 400 million at the time they believed to be the population of Negroes across the world. That was the number that they were believing to have been. But whatever it is, the reach of the organization through the vocal cords, because even Dr. Martin Luther King acknowledged that he represented the vocal cords of a people globally, right? And so what he brought and what he represented encompassed was broad enough, wide enough in scope to encompass all the needs of his people. And what I think a lot of people oftentimes underestimate was how sophisticated the organization was. And part of that level of sophistication had to do with the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey leadership and his scope and his vision and his massive organizational skills and his ability to arouse the masses to action. But another part of that is the unseen, oftentimes unacknowledged, and almost certainly under represented, under talked about, and underappreciated contributions that the right arm, or arguably the left arm, the left half, or arguably the right half, whichever you choose, of his brain, which operated through the physical body, the spirit, and the mind and intellect of Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey, or who I like to refer to respectfully as the Honorable Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey. In fact, so much of what people are talking about, so powerfully influencing their current day organizations and leaders and individuals who listen to them, unfortunately, they don't even acknowledge the person who is responsible for their knowing, right? All these intimate insights that we now have about the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, he did not write them about himself. He did not disclose to the world the intimate facts and circumstances of his childhood. He didn't share that in a writing or in a biography. That was in conversation that he had with his wife and confidant and partner. And that was a conversation that she then had with us through her multiple writings, including the book that she authored herself, Garvey and Garveyism, and her editing and publication of Philosophies and Opinions, both volumes, right? And so we have to stop for a quick second and say, who is this woman? And why should we be paying attention to her? And why should she not be swept under the rug? And why is it dishonorable of anyone to speak of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and not mention or even speak of her equally? Because what you know about him and all of the massive contributions largely is due to her efforts and her commitment and her undying, relentless advocacy for her husband, your leader, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, both during and after his death, after his life. I'm sorry. And so there's some things that we really need to do a self-reflection of and a self-assessment of and say, wait a minute, how do we know that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey in his inner thoughts came to the conclusion that the Black man needed his own king, his own diplomat, his own governing bodies, his men of big renown. How do we know that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey was thinking that as he was traveling between Europe, Jamaica, the Caribbean, the Virgin Islands to the United States? How do we know that in 1914 these were his inner thoughts? Because Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey captured these perfect, beautiful, and important insights about the development of the man from childhood all the way to adulthood, and then encapsulated all of these powerful insights into writings, into books that was originally going to be just for her benefit. When she was gathering all of his speeches and gathering all of his articles and anything that had written, even been written about him by either his enemies or his comrades or empathizers or sympathizers, whatever was said, she was constantly in archivist mode. She was constantly in historian mode. She was always thinking with an eye towards you and I, people who would never have a chance to meet him, people who would only rely on what the social media of the time was, which was arguably the Negro world, right? Like we tap into Instagram and Twitter. Well, folks back then, their social media was the Negro world. It was the most publicized international vocal cords communication systems that African people, it was so dangerous that people have been not only received capital punishment for having it, but it could lead to a total disruption of what little resources people were vying for at the time. It was utterly considered to be dangerous to possess one in certain places in Africa. It was considered treason in certain places in the Caribbean. And in the United States, even, it was smuggled. So Black folk back then, while we worry about smuggling drugs, they were smuggling information. They
Wow.
were, yeah, they were peddling, they were hustling the Negro world. And it came with massive consequences, right? And so there's something to be said of the fact that the woman who represented not only the vocal cords of the women, because she was she was completely concerned about people of African descent as a whole, our standing in the world, our position in the world, how we obtain the resources that make life livable, right? That provides dignity for man and woman, right? Women, we have a very important connection to resources, right? And one of the underlying themes of the UNIA and its core driving principles was the fact that the connection between races and resources was so visceral back then, right? They weren't necessarily interested in co-mingling and rubbing elbows with Europeans and people of European descent. It was about the ability to survive. It was about the ability to erect a house, fill it with water, fill it with food, fill it with heat, and not have someone come and roll right over it or run right through it or burn it to the ground, right? So these were the things that people were fighting for. They were so clear that their sheer existence was on the line. The ability to perpetuate themselves genetically was always at risk in this country and in all of this continents where Black people were found to be. So it was not an issue for them about whether or not they should be involved. It was a matter of life and death. And no one captured that more, that wisdom more than the Honorable Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey. One of the vehicles that she used to help communicate this information to us was through an editorial page in the Negro World. It was the women's page. She ran that. She was responsible for that page for several years before she took on an even greater role in the life of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and arguably in the lives of anyone of African descent who was living at that time. Because while she was not just an editor, she was an author, right? She was editing the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey's speeches at times. They worked together intimately because before she took on any massive role for the UNIA, she was the personal secretary of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. And there's a difference between being the secretary of the UNIA and being the personal secretary of the leader of the organization. She was responsible for helping him do his own work, right? She was his eyes and ears and his vocal cords. And before they ended up becoming married, she was already fulfilling a vital role in the UNIA. In fact, she was arguably suited for the role from the time she was born. I am under the impression that both the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and the Honorable Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey were product of circumstances, but not just of circumstances themselves. They are the divine solutions that the Most High, hearing the prayers of our ancestors, sent to help address an issue of global oppression, of this asymmetrical power dynamic between all peoples, whether they were European or Asian, or everyone had a leg up over people of African descent. And the writings was on the wall. It was the reason why the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey left Jamaica and headed to the Virgin Islands and went over to Panama and went to Ecuador and went to all of these different islands before heading over to Europe and seeing that the conditions of the world were almost exactly the same for people of African descent, no matter where they were. They were always at the bottom, always having their hat in their hands, always on the defensive, never having their needs met, never having positive relationships with governance or with security or with the resources of economics, right? They were being used, they were being abused, and he was tired of seeing it. And he knew that if there was going to be anything done about it, it was going to be because he had to do it. And so the creation of the UNIA in 1914 by the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, very much inspired by what was happening here with the Honorable Booker T. Washington and his incredible economic engine through Tuskegee University, inspired the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey to take a trip here. Now, while the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey was developing his political ideology and his political positions and principles and mores, the Honorable Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey was undergoing some similar experiences, but in another kind of way. She was born into a middle-class family in Jamaica as well. And she also received an education, but unlike many young ladies of her time, she received quite a superior education. And she was slated to be a nurse. Her father, who spoke multiple languages, including Spanish, had always, from the time she could read, always placed into her hands a newspaper and said to her, Amy, read this article, analyze it, and come back and tell me what it is that you have learned from it. And so over the course of the years, her father had already instilled in her the gift of political analysis, of legal analysis, of written analysis, right? I'm incorporating legal because that's an important part of her training as well. So when the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey was just 8 years old, Mama Charlotte and George Samuel Jock were surrounding the bed as she was giving birth to Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey, right? She was the second half of a solution that was the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. And although he would end up being in the United States the same year as her, they did not come together. And arguably, it depends on who you ask and when you ask, they had not had the kind of interactions that would lead them to the day that the Honorable Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey, that we know her to be today, approached him after hearing him talking in Harlem, New York, because they arrived here in the same year in 1917, but different times, different transportation modes, but still both ended up in Harlem. And she approached him and she told him what a great job he did with his oratory and how impressed she was, but that she still had some questions. And she started asking him some questions. And by the time she finished, she was thoroughly impressed, because it was very rare, at least probably for him at the time, to have engaged a woman who was so politically versed analytical and capable of challenging him in that way. And so he ended up inviting her to the UNIA headquarters and showing her around the office. And that was the day that changed her life forever.
Mm.
Because what she did, having had legal training, having had this gift of political analysis, and being able to always hold her own in the presence of men, something that her father instilled in her. She didn't have a usual upbringing. She had typesetting skills. She could type. She had gone and worked at a law firm. Her father had passed away. He would never have approved of that. But when he passed away, the attorney who was handling her father's estate knew that Mother Amy Jacques Garvey was an extremely intelligent, capable woman, and he wanted her to work in his law office. But her father initially rejected that. He was like, absolutely not. My daughter will never work around these groping, cursing, smoking men. But when her father passed, the opportunity came again, and the lawyer came to her mother and said, listen, Amy's a very capable woman. She needs to have the kind of challenges that a law firm could provide to her. And Mother Amy wanted it. She had no desire to be a nurse, which is what her father wanted her to be. She wasn't moved by that kind of work. She wasn't into the blood, if you will. But what did intrigue her was the challenge and the intellectual challenge of using her mind in ways that just weren't often afforded to people. You understand what I'm saying? So we're dealing with a very capable woman who brought with her to the UNIA when she walked into that office and a set of experiences and a set of skills that what we would refer to today in corporate world as organizational development skills, right? What she would bring to us today is what many first level or first year lawyers would bring to a law firm, right? She was, in all intents and purposes, a secretary. But when most people use the term secretary, they think of a woman typing and taking notes and representing. But everything a woman did back then, regardless of whether she was doing accounting work, right, or whether she was doing administrative work or HR work, or whether she was writing, anything she was contributing, it was she was a secretary, right? So it was a broad catch-all to describe the role of women who took on administrative duties. But that, if we left her right there as a personal secretary, we would miss so many opportunities to understand that this woman was almost a legal advocate. She came into the UNIA. She brought organizational structure. She helped alleviate some of the theft that was occurring by people who were taking advantage of the gaps in security, the lack of sophistication in some people's capacity for leadership and administration, right? And the fact that, well, like the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey said, he had so much work to do, such high level work, but he did not always have access to people who were capable of doing that work. There were a lot of people who had good intentions who would sign up, but they weren't capable of taking the organization to the level that he needed it to go. And so he often suffered because in addition to that, there is a cowardice that comes from people not wanting to speak up when they see injustice. We see it today, right? When they see wrongdoing because they're intimidated by people in powerful positions. So they don't report to him, someone's stealing money, or someone is engaging in behaviors that might jeopardize the UNIA's reputation, its repute, and even yours. Well, all of that changed the day Mother Amy Jacques Garvey walked into the UNIA headquarters while she was getting this tour. And she was horrified when she walked through the office and saw checks hanging on desks. Some of the envelopes hadn't even been opened in months. Papers were everywhere in disarray. The office was a mess. And she knew that he was in big trouble. And she's like, listen, you gotta organize your files. You gotta open up your documents. Being a legal representative, she knew that missing important deadlines, filing deadlines, could be the detriment of an organization. She knew that not having a chain of custody, right? Not having internal cash controls, if you're an accountant, or a chain of custody, if you're into law enforcement or legal, these were the things that she brought to the UNIA that helped to change the trajectory of the organization and help it to fulfill its divine purpose in the lives of African people, so many of whom saw it as its only hope, its gleaning hope, right? And although there was tremendous challenges to the organization in the form of the NAACP and other organizations that operated uh, in partnership with them to undermine everything that the UNIA was doing. Well, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey had a secret weapon, and that weapon was Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey. And there's so many angles that I can talk for her from about her from, but it's kind of important to give a little bit of background because people like to often say, "Oh, Amy." Oh, Amy. I've even heard people just refer to her as Amy, like she's some child or something, right? Oh, Amy. Oh, or worse, which one? Because we know that there was another woman in his life by the name of Amy Ashwood Garvey, right? And that was his first wife. And so people trivialize Mother Amy Jacques Garvey so much that they either reduce her to being, oh, you mean the wife of Marcus Garvey? Oh, yeah. We know all about her. Or do you mean the second wife? And they trivialize this, they have this imagination of some kind of real housewives drama unfolding in her life.
Mm.
And whatever the case may have been about how their relationship evolved or devolved or how it initiated, what's more important is if you are not willing to even take a look at what her role was and how significant she was. And it wasn't just about the UNIA and the market and the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey's reach encompassed the continent of Africa. And some of the leaders that there were people who she was in contact with who are global icons to this day. She connected with Mahatma Gandhi. She met Dr. George Washington. Uh, she met with Dr. Carver, Dr. George Washington Carver of Booker T. Washington School. She talked about her encounters with him and how humble he was. Every person that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey met with, she probably was the first contact. And when the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey got interrupted and incarcerated, it was the Honorable Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey who stepped into his shoes, literally, and kept the organization afloat. And not just that, with the help of some of his important, most loyal comrades, but not just that. She was also keeping him in good spirits. Can you imagine
Mm.
what it was like for him to be confined in that prison in Tombs and in Atlanta and not having the direct link to his people and knowing that he could trust Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey to take the words that he was giving out of his mouth to her directly to the people? Well, he never relented in anything that the UNIA was doing. In fact, he simply embodied her, empowered her, and created an itinerary for her, had her crisscrossing uh, this entire nation, going to different UNIA branches and keeping the message alive and raising money, not just for the UNIA's continuous needs and keeping the organization organized, but she was also raising now money for his legal defense. There was no rest for Queen Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey, and she did everything that she could do as a wife, but more importantly, as a global African leader and thought leader. This is a woman that we need to be paying very close attention to. I know
Yeah,
I've been talking. Do you have
yeah,
any?
no, you put a lot on the plate. You answered some of the questions that I had, but I'm gonna walk it back a little bit. You mentioned the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. This is something that she put together, and we would not have the book were it not for the work of Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey. But I read also that she put together the book as a fundraiser after he got incarcerated. Is that true?
Yeah, so the first time she compiled his philosophies and opinions, and which is a collection of speeches that he's given, articles that were written by him, things that he had said, any platform that she could collect, any articles or anything like that. She was always collecting them, clippings, newspaper articles, whatever it was she had, and she was just keeping it for her personal benefit. But then she said, I've got to make sure that the world has this. And that was the first volume. After he was incarcerated, however, one of the tasks that he asked her to accomplish, which was no light task, was to publish those. And again, but he wanted it to be published for the government officials and everyone who was in power. They needed to have a copy of it. So publishing back in the 20s was no light matter. Okay, so she had to stay up night after night, day after day, trying to get this done in as fast as possible. But she was also editing because, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, once he took the stage, there was no telling what was going to come out of his mouth. He held no bars, and some of the things that he was saying wasn't necessarily conducive to a man that we wanted to get out of prison, right? Or that the world would argue some of the comments in some of the speeches would have been used against him to reinforce the message that he was anti-European, anti-colonial, that he was a race baiter, that he wanted to kill everybody, right? So all of these things, she had to edit out some of the speeches so that they would be conducive to the message that they were trying to convey to the global world, right? Not just the African world, but the European world, the people who were trying to undermine everything that the UNIA was doing. So this was a very difficult task in front of a typewriter, day in and day out, to type out these things word by word, error by error, and make it so that it was presentable to global powers. She would then be responsible for sending them out to Congress, the members of Congress, senators, presidents, diplomats all over the world. So this was one of the important tasks that she had to do. It was so hard for her that by the time she finished, she was nearly blind in one eye, and she was about 90 pounds. It was almost took her out. So this was no light work.
Wow.
The people who were around her were very concerned about her health and her ability to survive, doing this. But as soon as she finished it and got it done, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey started out her on the next task. And while these things were going on, she was still raising money, she was still giving speeches, and she was still moving on behalf of the UNIA. So this was a very difficult time. In fact, the marriage was not a marriage of romance and love. The marriage was a combination of conveniences, and the fact that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey knew that with the legal threats that were pending, right? He had already been given notice that he was being charged by the state's attorney to, I think it's Kilpatrick, with charges of mail fraud, right? He had already had a lawyer. And what he knew was that there were so many compromising individuals within the UNIA that he needed someone who he knew could do the work, who had the integrity to speak up and bring it to his attention when there is wrongdoing occurring, right? Someone who was brave enough. Like, for example, one time when she started taking her role as personal secretary and she implemented what she referred to as the system, which meant that you couldn't just pick up a piece of mail that came in that might contain a check or might contain cash or might contain a membership form or might contain a notice from the government, whatever was coming to the UNIA headquarters, right? She implemented a system, a chain of custody that showed when it was received, who received it, who was the next person to open the envelope, who was responsible for the contents of the envelope, where did the money go, where did the chain go, when, stamped, person, right? So she implemented this very simple, but it was complex for people who didn't know how to do it and never had to exercise this level of discipline before, right? And what that system essentially ended up doing was removing the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey from touching any cash or any money in the organization. And everybody who did had to verify and report their interaction with that piece of mail. It's called like a chain of custody, right? And so what that did was it exposed any gaps in the chain. So if the mail clerk was the person who received, they had to instantly stamp, right? Date stamp, and report this is the piece of mail that goes to, let's say, the department that handles anything related to the shipping, and this is the department that handles anything that relates to membership, or this goes to banking, or whatever that piece of mail was supposed to do. The next person in the chain of command had to do their due diligence with that same system. What we're talking about is organizational development, right? Cash controls. These are accounting principles. These are principles of finance and good organization, right? These are the things that make an organization viable and accountable. And because the UNIA was a corporation in many respects, it had to abide, or its subsequent underlying entities, because UNIA owned grocery stores, it owned laundromats, it owned milling factories. They call it millineries, I think, millineries. It owns so many different types of businesses. We were responsible as an organization, or the UNIA was responsible for reporting its earnings, right? Just like any other organization. It had HR rules, it had employee obligations to meet, it had to be responsible for taxes. So it was very important to have these systems in place. And anything that could be used against the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey to implicate any wrongdoing, any mishandling of cash, or anything, it was going to be used to try to interrupt the work of the UNIA. And so the role that she played was essentially vital to the organization and to his ability to get out and raise funds and spread the message and galvanize membership, right? So everything that we think about in terms of organizations and even governments, the UNIA encompassed this in a microscopic way for the entire world. And it was why he was called the provisional, because what they were doing was putting the systems in place so that had their mission been accomplished successfully, they would be able to transport this system right to the continent and use that as the base to represent the global body of African people, no matter where we were. And Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey had such a pivotal role in that process. Her integrity, her courage, her ability to speak up and say what needs to be said when it needs to be said. That's the important thing. It means she had no friends and she was loaded with enemies. So much so that when she first put this system in place and found the individual who she believed was stealing money and confronted that individual, right? She said to him, listen, I was doing the due diligence on this department, and I noticed that when you received your portion or your responsibilities, you did not do your part. Where is this money? According to the records, we should be having an additional $300. You have to account for this. And that man became so irate with her. He cursed her. He yelled at her. He said, get your bony little behind. You could just imagine what he was saying to her, right? You're challenging me? Who are you? I don't have to explain to you. What are you? What's your role? Right? All kinds of accusations, right? Because she came with a level of integrity that they just had not seen before. And she was going to challenge you. And she said, I will be reporting you to the board because you are responsible. And she was about to leave. And he said, if you ever do it, I will throw you down those stairs. So the first threat to her life came from one of the larger members of the UNIA at the top level because he was stealing, and she caught him and she told on him and he got fired. And it comes to find out during his trials that he was actually one of the plants that
Wow, interesting.
had plant, and he ended up testifying against the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey.
Wow.
Why this is important is because we know this because Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey wrote about it in Garvey and Garveyism. This is the history lesson. It encompasses so much of our history, so much of the UNIA's internal conversations, right? So much that we know about. Even a lot of people don't know that the UNIA had within it secret levels of governance, what some people would refer to as secret societies. You would only know that if you read the Honorable Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey's work. And you won't even know you're reading her work because her voice is so politically astute, so sophisticated, and honestly, and I hate to say this, it was so masculine for what we know to be the writings and intellect of the time that even as I was reading the book myself, I had to do a double take because I thought I was hearing the voice of either the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey himself. You get so caught up in the story that's unfolding about his life, which is the story of the UNIA, which is vicariously a story of the African body politic at the time from almost 100-year span, right? And then you forget who is talking because she's so masterful in her third person writing that she purposely refuses to even acknowledge that she's in the story. You're actually reading the diary of a woman, a
Mm.
very intelligent, a very strategic, a very purposeful, intentional woman who had an eye for politics, a love for freedom of her people, and a special relationship with the conditions of Black women in the world.
Okay, so you mentioned the fact that she confronted a man that was a lot bigger than she was. I also heard another story that said that a would-be assassin showed up at the UNIA office, and his attempt was, or his goal was to try to assassinate the Right Honorable Marcus Garvey. And the story says that Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey got in between the gunman and Marcus Garvey, and even tumbled down the staircase with the gunman and the gun. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that was a rendition, but it wasn't Mother Amy Jacques Garvey. She was not married to him at the time. She was his personal secretary. But Amy Ashwood is the person who is alleged to have interjected her body. Now, Tony Martin did some work on that story, and you would have to read the work that he did about Mother Amy Ashwood and her life story. And you know, there's there's definitely an assassination attempt. There are definitely people on the scene. Mother Amy Ashwood was likely on the scene. She was, in fact, on the scene. There was another woman who was also involved in this shooting, right? But what ended up happening was that Mother Amy Ashwood said that she was the person who threw herself in between the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and the gunman's bullet, right? But it wasn't Mother Amy Jacques Garvey who was that. But she does talk about that particular incident in Garvey and Garveyism. And I would encourage anyone to read it. And Tony Martin did a great writing on Amy Ashwood that I think is worthy of reading as well in her story. I don't specialize, if you will, in Mother Amy Ashwood, although she is certainly worthy of study. My obsession is with Amy Jacques Garvey, and I kind of stay on my lane
Understood.
when it
Understood.
comes to her.
You said she had an opportunity to work for a period of time in a law office.
Mhm.
And we know that when the Right Honorable Marcus Garvey was charged with 25-cent mail fraud, he defended himself in the courtroom. I'm curious to know if he was getting advice from Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey in his defending himself.
Well, you know, it's interesting. He had an attorney. He felt like his attorney was compromised, and he decided to represent himself pro se, right? He decided to represent himself in court and argue on his own behalf. He did get advices from attorneys, but one of the things, interestingly, that was undeniable was the fact that in the mail fraud case, there was often the accusation that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey was directly involved in handling the funds. That was a constant Achilles heel that people were trying to use to say that he was stealing the money, that he was mishandling the money, that he wasn't qualified, that he was using the money for his personal interests. Any opportunity they had, like one time he went back to Jamaica, and a good childhood friend of his invited him to a racehorse because he loved horses. And he reluctantly went, and come to find out, the newspapers took pictures of him. You guys think we have scandals today? Like everything was a scandal back in that time, because you had literally the most important man. He was a terror in the eyes of European colonial land grabbers and colonial powers. So all eyes were on him, and also vicariously, all eyes were on her. And it was totally confusing how once he was incarcerated, the organization still kept on moving. And you know what the secret weapon was to that was her. But what she did when she uh, first got into the headquarters and she implemented the system, removing him, ironically, that became his defense. A large part of it was that he didn't have any direct interactions with the UNIA's monies,
Mm.
that we had an internal control system and he was not responsible for it. And even the part where he was supposed to review the reports at the end of the month or the end of the week, he even up asking her to take on that role. So he was completely removed from that aspect of the administration. He was at such a high level in the organization. His key responsibilities were going out, raising funds like all presidents of all corporations, raising money, increasing membership, spreading the message of the UNIA's mission, goals, and objectives. And how do we know what the mission, goals, and objectives are? Well, there's a lot of resources about that. You can glean it, you can figure it out, you can read some of the speeches that she's collected for us in Philosophies and Opinions, volumes 1 and 2. But also, and in volume 3, but also because Garvey and Garveyism, if you read that carefully, you will literally see an entire strategic plan. It's incredible. And those aren't the only writings. A lot of people don't know that she wrote what's called the Memorandum Correlative. And this was shortly before her own death, where she wrote a collection of writings. She provided a collection of writings to be shared with uh, international bodies on behalf of people of African descent. So our presence later on in what we now know as the United Nations, Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey was a massive part of that with her memorandum correlative, which was it was one of her biggest accomplishments in writing. She was so proud of it. And she did this almost from her sick bed. She was completely on her own financially, and not even having a secretary to help her with typing. She had arthritis after all those years of writing and typing, and exposing her body to the elements, doing all that travel under immense stress all the time, right? And constantly delivering. And we have failed to deliver to her the respect that she is due, unfortunately. I hope to change that whenever I get an opportunity to talk about her and her work.
Yeah. Now, if you search the Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey, they have her down on the internet as a journalist, but she was a lot more than that. She created a section of the newspaper called Our Women and What They Think. What were some of the topics touched on in that subject, in that section of newspaper?
She didn't create it, but she did become the editor for it. The Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey asked her to take on that responsibility. I think it was around 1923 when she was the editor for the women's page. And in that page, she used it to advocate on behalf of the political, social, and cultural needs of women of African descent, obviously. And so she talked on everything from the visceral lived experiences of women, the ability of women to engage in commerce, in business, in politics, and at the same time be the committed helpmate that she was to her own husband. She did not believe that women should be confined to domestication and domesticated roles, but that women had always been active in industry and commerce as Black women, right? Obviously through the context of slavery, right? So how is it that we as women should not play a key role in everything pertaining to the freedom, liberation, and expressions of African life? It's no reason why women should not be active in participation in politics and in governance, and even if necessary, war. She wrote about it in an article in 1925 entitled Women as Leaders. And I oftentimes will take some of her articles and share these articles with people in the form of the speeches, because so much of her writing feels like an oral experience, an oratory experience, right? She writes like a lawyer. She often starts with a conclusion raises the issue, talks about the rules, if you will, and then draws the analysis, right? She does that. She's written so many things, and not just her writings aren't limited, of course, and there are hundreds of writings for the Negro world, the women's page, but a lot of people don't realize she wrote her own um, speeches, and she also, of course, we know she oftentimes would edit some of his speeches, and she talks about that in Garvey and Garveyism. She would provide articles to him to read so that he would be always abreast of the latest issues, because they were a global people, so there was nothing happening in the world that didn't impact African people. So the war between China and the United States and the other European powers, when China was struggling for its own liberation, she talks about the role that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey played in that experience, about how it was his slogan, Africa for the Africans, Europe for the Europeans, and Asia for the Asiatics. Well, Asia for the Asiatics literally became the slogan of the movement for China's independence. That was a term that he coined, and she talks about it in one of her articles. She also wrote short stories and even poems. She oftentimes incorporates poetry into her speeches, and she was known to rile the crowd. I mean, she was an incredible orator. She was not someone that was, just a stand-in. She had a message. She knew the issues, she knew the rules, she knew the laws, she knew who was impacted, and she, more importantly, knew the consequences to African people, and especially women of African descent, if we failed in our efforts to achieve global independence for people of African descent. We are seeing the consequences of it today. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, always the last to be served, never can get full representation in government, always just a few of us who are able to climb to the top, who are thrown in our face as representatives of what we're all capable of, because therefore there's no racism, right? And so if this top celebrity, this top musician, this top political leader can do it, if you haven't done it, then it's because of some defect in your own life, right? It's not because of circumstances or racism. So the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey could foresee the challenges that we are facing today. And more importantly, what we can't seem to be able to grasp is the world that we're living in and how to interpret these things. You simply need to go back to 1920, 1921, 1919, 1918, and see the state that Black folk were in, what motivated them to grab on to the UNIA and fight for it with all their life, because it was the last chance for in the entire race, no matter where we were, to achieve the level of independence, political power, and even militaristic power that would be needed to defend the people. We're going to find out, and all you have to do is look at the conditions after World War II that Black men were facing and their women were facing, and you'll see what the future looks like in the United States right now for the rest of us, because we do not study the lessons, we do not analyze it, and we brush aside the people who even today are still so relevant. Mother Amy Jacques Garvey wrote an article in 1917 in the midst of the conflict between China and the European global powers, including the United States. And she says, Africa bides her time. And it was literally about the role that people of African descent are playing in the world and what they were learning from the Chinese Revolution and what we could expect from Africans. It's a very, very chilling story, but it shows us the same players, China, Russia, United States, and Europe, happening almost to the year 100 years ago. It's really incredible, and I would encourage people to look up her writing on Africa Bides Her Time.
Now, in my book, the fact book, I did a section where I talked about Kwanzaa, and I did some research. I had interviewed some elders in the state of California, one in particular, and he told me a story I found to be very interesting. He said that there was a brother that worked for California State University in San Diego. This is the 1960s. Dr. Arthur Graham. He was head of the Black Student Council at the time. Dr. Arthur Graham was in contact with Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey. This is the 1960s.
Okay.
There was not a lot of books available on Marcus Garvey and his teachings, and there was just not a lot of history, available. So Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey was thoughtful enough to send him some papers of some things that Marcus Garvey had written. And among them was the brochure entitled Aims and Objectives for Movement of Negro People.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Arthur Graham was very impressed with this. So he read it. And from that, he extracted 7 ideas, that key ideas that Marcus Garvey was trying to convey in the aims and objectives. He took that list and he gave it to Joe Vincent, who was a student at California State University at the time. And he asked him if he could have that list translated into Kiswahili, so we
Mm-hmm.
would have an African value system for people of
Mm-hmm.
African heritage. And so he knew Dr. Maulana Karenga at the time. Dr. Karenga, this is in the 1960s, he already knew Kiswahili at this time. And so he gave that list to Dr. Maulana Karenga, and he translated that into what we know now is the Nguzo Saba.
Wow.
Now, not only that, there was a meeting in the living room of Joe Vincent and his wife Gloria Vincent in San Diego. They were trying to start a chapter of the US organization in San Diego. And at that meeting, Joe Vincent said to Dr. Karenga, he said, with all this holiday stuff going on, it's very European centered. He said, why don't you start a holiday for Black people and base it on African culture and base it on those 7 principles? And Dr. Karenga came back with Kwanzaa. So
Oh,
that
wow.
being said, the Nguzo Saba and the holiday and the celebration of Kwanzaa would not exist if it were not for Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey. Did you know that?
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's very powerful. You connecting the dots. I love that.
Yeah.
That's very artful. I did not know that. I'm so
Okay.
excited to hear that.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
That's not widely known, but we're
Yeah.
on the subject of Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey. I have to mention that because Kwanzaa is like a worldwide
Hmm.
thing now, and
Wow.
the Nguzo Saba
Yeah.
is something that's acknowledged around the world even. And if it wasn't for Queen Mother Amy Jacques
Wow.
Garvey sending something in the mail to somebody, we wouldn't have
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, her one of her chief characteristics. I mean, when she was doing Garvey and Garveyism, she was fighting, tooth and nail for the energy to do it, but she was so motivated by her relationship with her husband that even in his passing, the communication never stopped. And so she was so driven to make sure that the world knew his legacy because most of what was written about him by the outside world was so derogatory, disparaging, negative, and just outrageous. Like these articles where they were just trying to make him look like a buffoon. And you could also have counted on W.E.B. Du Bois and those others. I mean, if you got to see the way people were referring to the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, calling him all kinds of names, monkey, saying
Mm,
that he was trying to raise money for his monkey island. I mean, the
wow.
kind of fortitude that it had to have to do the kind of fighting that he was doing, because he wasn't just fighting European colonial powers, he was literally fighting his own people in many instances and people who were in high places. But the majority of Black people adored him and they valued him and they could see through the lies. And one of those people who was so instrumental in helping him to get the message out and then preserving his legacy was Mother Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey. And I hope that people will really take a moment to see how ridiculous they sound and how disrespectful it is to not say her name when they are saying his name.
Mm,
They first of all they shared a hive mind, okay, because at certain point she was so attuned to his message. There was even in their intimate moments, their private time after he was back home, they shut the bedroom door. They were still thinking about people of African descent in our condition. She would then, after all that hard work for his day, hand him the article of a newspaper and make him go over it. And sometimes they would even argue or debate about it until one of them won the argument. And he would either say, okay, Mupsi, you win, or sometimes he would win. But the key is they valued each other for their intellect and for their absolute compassion and relentlessness towards African liberation, whatever you want to call that, today. But I can't think of a more powerful couple. And it's like principles of light and dark, of the seen and the unseen. although you don't necessarily see her in the public as much, trust and believe if you're seeing him, you're seeing her. And if you're seeing her, you're seeing him, because everything she devoted her entire life to ensuring that he was successful, that he was in a prime position, that his potential as a man, that she was not interfering with his capacity for leadership, that she was always adding to, and never in one time did she ever drop her commitment to the needs of women of African descent. Whether she was doing it through the women's page or whether she was in Europe speaking to white women about what they can do to help alleviate some of the suffering that their husbands are causing our people, right? She never ceased in her advocacy for our people, and we should never cease in our appreciation and our study of her as well. I wish I could tell everything that I need to tell about what she does and all of the powerful contributions and insights that she has. But it's going to take some time. And unfortunately, oftentimes when people are, preparing their events about Marcus Messiah Garvey using her content, they don't even think to ask what Mother Amy want us to say about her, right? They don't even make her an issue. And I think that is disrespectful. I think it's shameful. I think it's a reflection of poor thinking. And it's part of the reason why our organizations aren't moving forward, because she's the key to much of the organizational development. She can tell you if you sat down to analyze her work, but you've got to submit yourself. You've got to show some humility, and you've got to say, I don't know everything, and ask the question, what would Mother Amy Jacques Garvey want us to know, and what would she do, and how would she advise us? Because she was the vocal cords of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey when he could not speak for us, and vicariously, therefore, since he was the vocal cords of the entire race, so was she.
Okay, that's a good note to end on. We're at the end of our hour. I do want to thank you for coming and sharing so much information about Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey. This is a subject that we need to continue to revisit and know more about, because I'm sure there's more you can say that will go past the 1 hour mark. But for people that want to maybe get more information, because she also wrote poetry, she wrote articles, some of which is available online. How would you direct the person if they want to continue to do more research on Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey?
Well, I would start with her book, Garvey and Garveyism. I would go back and take another look with her in mind when you're looking at Philosophies and Opinions, volumes 1, 2, and 3. She wrote a book called Black Power in America, I think is the title. I always get the title mixed up. But there have been some writings about her. There's Amy Jacques, The Veiled Garvey, which is one of my favorite reads. There is The Veiled Garvey. And you can even find a collection of her writings by, there was a professor, it's called Amy Jacques Garvey Selected Writings. Amy Jacques Garvey, that's part of the title, Amy Jacques Garvey Selected Writings. There's a professor at a university who took the onerous task of gathering some of her speeches, articles, editorials, and published them so that we can have some deeper insights about her. I do reenactments of her sometimes when I'm invited to, where I take speeches and do a little bit more of a longer talk about her life from her childhood. And if anyone wants to see an article that I've written about her, that's supposed to be a three-part, it's supposed to be a three-part article. And I only wrote the first part because I thought that article was gonna just like, I just thought I was gonna get a better response from it. I was so in love with her, and I was like, I gotta write about this. And so I was kind of disappointed. And so I never published the second two parts of the article. But if you want to read the first part of the article, I wrote it years ago. We want to read the first part of the article. It's called you might not know her name, but she was the most significant woman of the 20th century, right? And I'm not just talking about Black women. I'm talking about women. So much of what she has done contributed to the way our current system of government operates to this day. And so you can find that article on my website, SheilaBrownSpeaks.com. I have a page called the AJG Project, which stands for Amy Jacques Garvey Project, which is kind of like a personal project for me whenever I have a chance to my favorite topic talk about. I'll be glad to do so. So I've just been taking my experiences, whether I'm in Harlem, doing a tour of ancient Harlem, looking at all the sites that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey talked at, or where he stood, or where certain events were. Even the spot, I think, where they docked the ship, the Frederick Douglass. I think I found it. It has much has changed because the street name doesn't exist anymore. But when I did my analysis of where they were in relationship to things, I think I found it, and it's a real body of water right there. So I have put some of that on that page, like things like that. So anything you're interested in what I'm doing around her life, you can go to SheilaBrownSpeaks.com and go to the AJG project. And of course, you can do your own research on her. There are tons of events that she should be invited to in spirit by including her in conversations, anything the UNIA does. If you're not talking about Mother Amy Jacques Garvey, it's very difficult for me to take you seriously, because what is the UNIA without Queen Mother Amy Female Jacques Garvey? She was his life force. She was his so many different things. I don't want to just throw words out there without having the opportunity to explain it. And I know we're out of time, but she's worthy of our attention. And I hope you will take some time to learn a little bit more about her if you haven't heard of her before.
Yeah, we got Thurgood Dukes in the chat. He said he wants to thank you for enlightening him, and he said he's going to do some more research on Queen Mother Amy Jacques Garvey, because of your conversation. So, yeah, we want to definitely thank you, and I would like to actually think that we could bring you back next month so we could speak on the subject of water. That's a whole nother subject, but we're going to come back to that next month. But either way, I want to thank you. SheilaBrownSpeaks.com, right?
Yep, SheilaBrownSpeaks.com, AJG Project is a page on my
project. So I would send everybody to that, SheilaBrownSpeaks.com. Sister Sheila Brown, we want to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you again the next time.
I'm so humbled. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.